You are going to stop explaining yourself. Not to everyone, not about everything, but enough that your life stops feeling like an ongoing trial where you're perpetually the defendant. That's the promise of this video, and I'm not going to spend 3 minutes circling it before I say what it means. Picture the moment someone asks you in that tone why you did something, and instead of your stomach dropping and the justifications lining up on your tongue, you just don't answer the way you used to. You feel calm instead of caught, grounded instead of scrambling for the right combination of words to make the discomfort go away. That calm isn't a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't. It's a trained response, and it's trainable in you starting today. And later in this video, I'm going to show you why the most convincing explanation you will ever give someone is also the one that costs you the most power, why explaining yourself, even when you're completely right, can quietly be the very thing that keeps you small. But first, comment the word silent if you're ready to actually reclaim this instead of just nodding along. Here's what your week actually looks like if you're honest about it instead of the version you'd tell a stranger. You order something at a restaurant and, unprompted, add a small apology to the waiter about why you're not getting the special. You tell a coworker why you left at 5 instead of 6, even though nobody asked, even though your contract says 5. You explain to your mother, again, why you're not coming home for a holiday you've explained 4 times already. You justify your career change to a cousin at a wedding who didn't actually want an answer, just wanted to feel like they clocked something. By the end of the week, you've spent hours, real hours, defending decisions that were never on trial in the first place, except in your own head, where you appointed yourself both defendant and prosecutor. The cost isn't just time. It's your self-respect quietly leaking out of 100 small justifications until you start to wonder if you actually need permission to live your own life. And it doesn't stay contained to the big moments either. It shows up in the way you word a text message 3 times before sending it, adding softening phrases nobody asked for. It shows up in the way you rehearse an entire conversation in the shower before a 5-minute phone call that was never going to be adversarial in the first place. It shows up in the specific familiar exhaustion of coming home from a totally ordinary day and feeling like you've been in 6 small negotiations you never agreed to enter, defending choices that were entirely yours to make to people who mostly weren't even keeping score. Epictetus, who spent years enslaved before becoming one of the sharpest minds in Rome, built his entire philosophy around one line dividing the world into what's within your control and what isn't. Your actions are yours, other people's opinions of your actions were never yours to manage, and yet you've been managing them anyway, for free, unpaid, exhausted. None of this feels dramatic in the moment, which is exactly why it's so easy to miss. Nobody sits you down and points out that you just apologized for a decision that hurt no one. It happens in fragments, scattered across an ordinary day, so small each time that you'd feel ridiculous complaining about any single instance of it. But add them up across a week, a month, a year, and you get a person who has quietly trained everyone around them to expect a justification for absolutely everything, including things that were never anyone else's business in the first place. That training didn't happen to you. You built it, one small over-explanation at a time, usually with good intentions, usually trying to keep the peace, and it's cost you more peace than it ever protected. So here's the core idea, and this is the whole spine of the video. Explaining yourself is not the same thing as respecting people, and withholding an explanation is not the same thing as disrespecting them. That's the entire law. Let's kill the obvious objection immediately, because if we don't, you'll spend the next 15 minutes arguing with me instead of listening. This is not permission to become cold, evasive, or dismissive to people who genuinely deserve context. A partner, a close friend, someone directly affected by your choice still deserves honesty and warmth. This isn't about withholding care. It's about withholding your justification from the specific people who were never entitled to it in the first place: the acquaintance, the critic, the extended family member performing concern, the stranger in the comments. And this puts you directly against something the culture rewards constantly: the performance of accountability. We've built a world where over-explaining gets mistaken for humility, where the person who justifies every move looks relatable and down to earth, while the person who simply states a decision and moves on gets called arrogant. The Stoics would call that exact confusion a trap, mistaking a performance of goodness for actual goodness, mistaking noise for virtue. Real power, quiet power, doesn't need a jury. Let's build that person now, lesson by lesson, starting with the easiest habit to break and ending with the one that will change how people experience you completely. Before we start, one honest warning. This is going to feel wrong at first, maybe even rude, because you've spent years associating explanation with kindness. Unlearning that association is uncomfortable in a specific physical way, a held breath, a small flush of anxiety right before you let a silence sit where words used to automatically fill the gap. That discomfort isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign the old pattern is finally being interrupted instead of running on autopilot. Think about where the habit actually came from, because it usually wasn't random. Somewhere along the way, explaining yourself thoroughly enough kept the peace, or avoided a punishment, or earned a parent's approval, or smoothed over a conflict you weren't equipped to handle any other way at the time. It worked once in a context where you had far less power than you have now. The habit simply never got the memo that the context changed. You're not broken for still running it, you're just running an old program on a body and a life that outgrew the reasons it was written for in the first place. Lesson 1, and it's the smallest place this shows up. Stop explaining the tiny harmless choices nobody actually needs a reason for. Picture yourself at a family dinner, reaching for a second helping and hearing yourself say, I know, I shouldn't, before anyone said a single word. Picture declining a drink and immediately adding, I'm just not feeling it tonight, to a room that asked nothing, wanted nothing, and would have accepted a simple no thanks without blinking. It sounds trivial written down like this, and that's exactly why it slips past unnoticed for years. Nobody would call any single instance a problem, so it never gets questioned. It just quietly becomes the default setting you run every single interaction through. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself that other people's business is not his business, and the reverse is just as true. Your small, harmless choices are not other people's business either, no matter how instinctively you hand them the microphone. Psychologists describe a version of this as the spotlight effect, our tendency to wildly overestimate how much attention other people are actually paying to our small, everyday decisions. Nobody at that dinner table was tracking your second helping the way you assumed they were. Here's the reframe. Over-explaining tiny choices isn't politeness, it's a rehearsed apology for existing exactly as you are, delivered before anyone even asked for one. Today, notice one small moment where you're about to justify something nobody questioned, and simply let the silence stand where the explanation used to live. You'll feel the old reflex rise up in your chest, the urge to add just because or no real reason at the tail end. Let that urge pass without acting on it, and notice by the end of the day how much quieter your internal monologue has become without that constant background narration running underneath every small choice you make. Lesson 2, and this is where it starts to matter more. Stop explaining your no past the first sentence. You already know the scenario: someone asks for a favor, and instead of a clean no, you deliver 4 supporting paragraphs. Your schedule, your energy, your other commitments. Anything to soften the blow and make the no feel earned, rather than simply decided. You watch their face while you're talking, gauging whether you've supplied enough reasons yet, as though there's some threshold of justification that will finally make a simple no acceptable to say out loud. Seneca told a friend that peace of mind comes from ceasing to auction off your time to whoever asks loudest, and every extra sentence of justification you attach to a no is, functionally, still bidding for their approval of your decision. This connects to something psychologists call approval-seeking behavior, a learned pattern, where your sense of safety gets tied to whether others accept your reasoning, not just your right to decide. The reframe: a shorter no isn't rudeness, it's just a decision that doesn't require a jury to ratify it. Practice this today. The next time you decline something, say the no, add 1 sentence at most, and then stop talking, even when the silence afterward feels loud. Resist the urge to fill it with a second explanation the moment the first one lands. That silence is not a gap you fail to close, it's the boundary itself doing its job exactly as intended without your help. Here's a question worth sitting with before we move on. How many of your last 10 decisions were actually explained because someone needed the information, and how many were explained because you needed the discomfort in the room to go away? Be honest. Most of them were the second one. That's exactly what lesson 3 is built around. Lesson 3, and here it starts to sharpen. Stop pre-defending decisions before anyone has even criticized them. Picture yourself walking into a room already rehearsing your defense for a choice nobody has challenged yet: the new job, the relationship, the way you're raising your kids, the way you spend your money building an entire case in your head for a courtroom that was never actually convened. You can spend an entire car ride mentally preparing counter-arguments for a conversation that, once it actually happens, never even touches the topic you spent 20 minutes defending in your head. Epictetus called this a kind of self-inflicted suffering, worrying in advance about judgments that may never arrive, spending real energy defending against an imagined prosecutor. This is closely related to what psychologists call anticipatory anxiety, where the brain treats a predicted social threat with almost the same intensity as an actual one, even when the threat never materializes. Here's the counterintuitive part. Pre-defending a decision often signals to people that there's something to question, when your calm silence about it would have signaled the opposite entirely. The reframe: you don't owe anyone, a defense attorney's opening statement for a trial that hasn't started and may never start. This week, catch yourself rehearsing a justification for something nobody has questioned yet, and consciously set it down instead of running the imaginary trial to its imaginary end. Ask yourself plainly whether anyone has actually asked you to justify this, or whether you're rehearsing a defense for a prosecutor who exists only in your own head. Most of the time, when you check honestly, the courtroom is empty. You built it, you staffed it, and you can dismiss it just as easily. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Notice that none of the first 3 lessons asked you to change a single decision you've made. Not one. They only asked you to change what you do after the decision, whether you defend it, explain it, or simply let it stand. That's the whole game, and it only gets sharper from here. Lesson 4 escalates into family, which is where most people find this genuinely hardest. Stop justifying the boundary itself, only state it. Picture the parent, the sibling, the old friend who asks why not. The moment you say you can't make it, won't be discussing something, or need space, and instead of holding your line, you cave into an essay explaining your reasoning, hoping a good enough explanation will finally earn their acceptance. There's a specific pattern here worth naming. The boundary gets stated. The pushback arrives right on schedule, and instead of holding steady, you quietly start negotiating with yourself before they've even finished their sentence, already drafting a compromise nobody asked you to draft. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he could waste an entire life trying to win the approval of people whose approval he could never actually control, and that the attempt itself was the waste, not the outcome. This lines up with what psychologists call the drama triangle, a well-known relational pattern where over-explaining a boundary to someone who keeps pushing back often invites them into the role of judge, which then invites you, without meaning to, into the role of defendant over and over, in a loop that never resolves because you keep supplying new evidence for a trial that was never fair to begin with. The loop only breaks when one side stops supplying new material, and it might as well be you, since you're the one paying the cost of keeping it running. The reframe, "I can't make it," is a complete sentence. It is not a partial sentence waiting for supporting evidence. Today, if a boundary comes up, say it once, plainly, and if you're pushed for a reason, allow yourself to simply repeat the boundary instead of expanding it into a new argument. This will feel unnatural the first few times, almost stubborn, because you've been trained to believe love means unlimited access to your reasoning. It doesn't. Love survives a boundary stated plainly. What it rarely survives, over time, is a relationship where one person is permanently on trial for simply wanting something different. Notice, the next time you hold a boundary this way, how much less drained you feel by the end of the conversation compared to the version where you argued your case for 20 minutes and still didn't fully convince anyone, including yourself. Lesson 5, and the stakes climb again here. Stop relitigating your past to people meeting the current version of you. Picture a new coworker, a new partner's family, a new friend group, asking about an old job you left abruptly, a relationship that ended badly, a version of you from 5 years ago that you've already done the work to move past, and watch yourself instinctively reach for the full defense file, dates and receipts and context, as if you're still on trial for a version of yourself that no longer exists. It's a strange thing to notice. Once you catch it, you'll produce a more detailed account of a mistake from years ago for a stranger at a dinner party than you would for someone who actually deserves that level of access to your life. Seneca reminded a grieving friend that dwelling endlessly in a painful chapter doesn't honor the lesson learned from it. It just reopens the wound for an audience that mostly just wanted small talk. Psychologists describe something related called rumination, the tendency to replay and re-narrate past events far beyond what's useful for actually processing them. And every retelling to a new, low-stakes audience is a small act of rumination dressed up as politeness. The strange part is that it rarely even satisfies the other person the way you hope it will. Most casual acquaintances forget the details of your explanation within the hour, while you carry the residue of having relived it for the rest of the day. Here's the reframe. You're allowed to let your history stay history. You don't have to re-earn people's understanding of who you were in order to be accepted as who you are now. Practice this today. The next time your past comes up in casual conversation, offer one sentence and let it close, instead of reopening the whole file for someone who was only making small talk. Notice how much lighter it feels to let a chapter actually stay closed, instead of handing out fresh copies of it to every new person who wanders into your life and asks a casual question expecting a casual answer. If you've made it this far, you already think differently than most people watching this, because most people close a video the moment it stops entertaining them and starts asking something of them. Here's one small thing before we go further. If any of this has landed so far, save this video right now, because you'll want to come back to the second half once you've actually tried the first 5 lessons this week, and saved videos get revisited far more than liked ones ever do. And remember what I told you at the very start about how the most convincing explanation you'll ever give can be the very thing that costs you the most power? That's exactly where we're headed next, and it's sharper than anything we've covered so far. Lesson 6, and now we move from defense into something more dangerous, explaining your success to people who never wanted you to have it. Picture the moment you share good news, a raise, a new relationship, a body you feel proud of, a business finally working, and instead of simply enjoying it, you instinctively minimize it, over-explain the luck involved, downplay the effort, apologize slightly for having something good happen to you in front of someone who doesn't. You'll catch yourself adding little disclaimers mid-sentence, "It's not a huge deal," or "I got kind of lucky honestly," reflexively sanding down the edges of your own joy before anyone even asked you to. Marcus Aurelius wrote that he refused to shrink his own good fortune just to make it easier for others to sit beside, because doing so would have been a small betrayal of the truth. This connects to social comparison theory, the well-documented psychological finding that people often unconsciously manage their own visible success downward, specifically to avoid triggering envy or discomfort in people around them, at real cost to their own confidence and self-expression. It's worth noticing how selective this instinct usually is. You probably don't downplay bad news the same way a setback, a failure, a hard week gets told plainly, sometimes even amplified for sympathy. It's specifically the good news that gets the disclaimer, which tells you this was never really about honesty. It was about managing other people's feelings at the direct expense of your own. Here's the reframe. Explaining away your success to keep someone else comfortable isn't kindness, it's a quiet tax you're paying on your own life to keep someone else from feeling something they're responsible for feeling on their own. Today, when good news comes up, practice stating it plainly, without the built-in apology tacked onto the end. Say the good news the same way you'd state a fact about the weather, clearly, without flinching, without pre-shrinking it to make someone else's discomfort more manageable. Their discomfort, if it comes, was never actually yours to carry in the first place. Lesson 7, and here's where it gets sharper still. Stop explaining your silence or your absence as if disappearing from a group chat or a room for your own reasons requires a permission slip. Picture skipping an event, going quiet on a message thread for a few days, or simply needing distance from a person and feeling the compulsive need to produce a tidy explanation the moment you resurface, as though your absence itself was an offense that needs a formal apology attached. You'll notice this one especially in group settings, the message that starts with "Sorry, I've been MIA," before anyone has even indicated they noticed, offered up preemptively, like a fine you're paying before the ticket was ever issued. Epictetus taught that your time and attention are the only truly yours things you have, and that constantly explaining how you spent them to people who weren't owed an account is really just handing ownership of your own hours back over to them. This connects to what psychologists call people-pleasing patterns, rooted in a learned belief, usually formed early, that withdrawing without explanation will be punished, so a preemptive explanation gets offered to avoid a conflict that, in most adult relationships, was never actually coming in the first place. Here's the reframe. Your absence doesn't automatically require a defense. Rest doesn't require a defense. Distance doesn't require a defense. This week, let one absence go unexplained and notice with some discomfort at first that the relationship survives it completely intact. If it doesn't survive it, that tells you something important too about how much of that relationship was actually built on your constant availability rather than on anything more solid. Lesson 8 escalates into something most people never even think to question. Stop explaining your healing to people who watched you struggle. Picture the friend or family member who knew you at your lowest point after the breakup, the diagnosis, the financial collapse, the burnout, and who still, months or years later, subtly expects a running commentary on your recovery. Checking in with a tone that says, "Prove to me you're actually better now." Watch yourself over-explain your own healing, your own better mood, your own progress, as if you owe them a full audit of your internal state because they witnessed the low point. There's a specific version of this that shows up almost every time: the friend who says, "Are you sure you're okay?" with a slight tilt of the head, not because anything in the current moment suggests otherwise, but because their memory of you is still frozen at the worst month of your life, and any calm you display now reads to them as suspicious rather than earned. Seneca wrote that growth is often disbelief by people who only ever knew you in the wreckage, and that their disbelief says far more about their frozen memory of you than it says about the truth of who you've become. This connects to cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort people feel when new information about you conflicts with an old fixed story they've been carrying about who you are, and how that discomfort sometimes gets projected outward as suspicion of your growth rather than acceptance of it. It's not usually malicious. Most people aren't trying to keep you stuck. They're just working from outdated information and haven't done the work of updating the file, which means the burden of updating it keeps quietly landing back on you, again and again, unless you refuse to keep supplying new material for a story that should have ended already. There's a quiet grief in this one that the earlier lessons don't quite touch. The people asking, "Are you sure you're okay?" usually loved you through the hard part, which makes it harder to simply stop answering them the way the earlier, easier lessons let you stop answering an acquaintance or a coworker. But love doesn't require you to stay smaller than you've become just to keep someone else's memory of you intact. The kindest thing you can do for both of you is let your calm, ordinary days speak for themselves instead of narrating your own recovery on command. Here's the reframe. You don't owe anyone a documented case file proving you've healed. Your peace doesn't need to be cross-examined by someone still holding on to the old version of your pain. Today, if someone questions your improvement in a way that feels like doubt dressed as concern, answer with one calm sentence and let your actual life, over time, be the only evidence you offer. You are not obligated to keep performing recovery for an audience that formed its opinion of you during your worst chapter and never bothered to update it since. Lesson 9. And we're nearly at the turn. Stop explaining decisions you've already fully made, as if reopening the reasoning could somehow unmake them. Picture the moment you've genuinely decided something, ending a friendship, moving cities, leaving a role, and someone keeps circling back, asking "but why though?" in 5 different phrasings, hoping that if they ask enough ways, you'll eventually produce the magic explanation that reverses the decision. Sometimes it's not even hostile. Sometimes it comes from someone who loves you and is genuinely struggling to accept the change, which makes it harder to hold the line, because part of you wants to keep negotiating just to ease their discomfort, even though the decision itself was never actually theirs to weigh in on. Marcus Aurelius wrote that once a judgment is truly settled within you, revisiting it endlessly for someone else's comfort doesn't make it more true, it just makes you less settled. This lines up with something psychologists call the sunk cost pattern in conversation, where continuing to re-argue a closed decision feels productive because you've already invested so much explanation into it, even though no amount of additional explanation will change a decision that was never actually up for negotiation. Here's the reframe. A decision you've already made doesn't need to survive a second trial just because someone didn't like the verdict the first time. Practice this today. If someone reopens a decision you've genuinely closed, say, "That's already decided once," and let that be the complete answer, however many times it takes to be believed. Repetition without expansion is not stubbornness. It's clarity delivered patiently to someone who's hoping patience will eventually wear you down into a different verdict. Hold that clarity as many times as it takes, and notice that it takes fewer times than you feared once they realize the trial genuinely isn't reopening. Lesson 10, and this is the sharpest one, the one that ties the whole video together right before the turn. Stop explaining who you're becoming to people who only ever knew who you were. Picture the version of you quietly shifting new values, a new pace, new priorities, a person growing in a direction some of the people around you never signed up for, and watch the old instinct kick in, the urge to narrate the change for them in real time, to build a bridge of explanation sturdy enough that nobody gets left behind or confused by the new you. There's a specific exhaustion to this one that the earlier lessons don't quite capture. Because it's not about defending a single decision, it's about defending an entire ongoing direction, months after months, to people who keep expecting you to check in and account for a version of yourself that's still being built. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person doesn't need to announce their own transformation. That character reveals itself through action over time, not through a running commentary delivered for the benefit of an audience that may not even be paying attention. This connects to identity-based psychology, specifically the idea that constantly explaining a change in progress can actually slow the change itself, because narrating an identity before it's settled keeps inviting outside feedback into a process that needs quiet and time to actually take hold. Every time you explain the new direction before it's finished forming, you invite someone else's opinion into a room that should have stayed closed a while longer, and their opinion, well-meaning or not, has a way of reshaping the thing you were still in the middle of building. Here's the reframe. You don't owe anyone a press release about who you're turning into. The people who matter will notice over time, through your actions, without a briefing. The people who don't matter were never going to understand the briefing anyway. Starting today, let one piece of your ongoing growth stay unexplained, and let your future actions be the only announcement it ever needs. And now here's the turn, the thing I told you about in the very first 30 seconds. Almost everyone believes that a good enough explanation is how you win people over, how you prove you're reasonable, how you keep the peace and avoid being misunderstood. And almost everyone has it backwards, because the moment you explain yourself to someone who was never actually entitled to the explanation, you quietly hand them a new power over you, the power to grade your reasoning, to decide whether your why was good enough, to keep the conversation open until they, not you, feel satisfied. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all 10 of these lessons. Explaining yourself to someone who didn't earn that access doesn't close the loop, it opens a new one. Because now your peace depends on whether they accepted your case. That's precisely why the most convincing explanation you can offer is often the most expensive thing you can give away. It feels like control in the moment, but it's actually a transfer of control dressed up as reasonableness. This is the part that backfires for most people who try to earn respect the obvious way, by explaining harder, more thoroughly, more patiently, because every additional explanation is still underneath an application for someone else's approval. Real reclaimed power doesn't sound like a better argument, it sounds like a shorter sentence, delivered calmly, followed by nothing at all. Think about the last time you actually respected someone's decision without needing their reasons. Chances are you didn't need a paragraph. A calm, "that's what I've decided," was enough. And something about the plainness of it made you trust them more, not less. Now flip it around. Every time you've over-explained, hoping to earn that same trust from someone else, you were quietly working against yourself, because a defense, no matter how airtight, reads as a request for a verdict, and a request for a verdict always signals that the outcome is still somehow up for debate. The people who move through the world with the most quiet authority aren't the ones with the best answers. They're the ones who stopped treating ordinary decisions like questions that needed answering at all. This is also the part where the title of this video finally makes complete sense. Reclaiming your power was never about getting louder, sharper, or more convincing in your arguments. It was about noticing how much of your power you'd been quietly signing away, one explanation at a time, to people who never even asked for the deed. So here's who you become, specifically, once this stops being new. You decline the second helping without the apology stapled onto it, and nobody at the table even notices, because they were never counting the way you assumed. You say no in one sentence and let the silence afterward do its work. Instead of filling it with evidence, you stop pre-defending decisions nobody has challenged, and something in your shoulders relaxes that's been tense for years without your noticing. You hold a boundary with family in one plain sentence and repeat it calmly instead of writing a new essay every time it's tested. Your past stays past. You offer one sentence when it comes up and let it close instead of reopening the file for casual company. Your success stays yours, stated plainly, without the built-in apology for having something good happen to you. Your absence stops requiring a permit. Your healing stops requiring an audit. A decision you've made stays made however many times someone asks, but why in a new outfit? You're not explaining less because you stopped caring about people. You're explaining less because you finally understand which explanations were ever actually theirs to receive. The world hasn't gotten quieter. People still ask, still push, still want their version of events to win. But your relationship to all of it has changed completely. From the inside, where the actual power always lived, people will start to phrase things differently around you, almost without noticing they're doing it. Fewer "why did yous?" Fewer raised eyebrows waiting for a paragraph that never comes. Somewhere along the way, without ever announcing it, you became a person whose decisions are simply taken at face value because you stopped supplying the material for anyone to argue with. That's not distance, that's not coldness. That's just what it feels like to finally stop standing trial for a life that was always only yours to live. You still show up for people, you still laugh loudly, still celebrate, still comfort, still show up at 2 in the morning if someone actually needs you. None of that requires explanation to disappear. What disappears is the constant, low-grade legal defense running underneath your ordinary choices. The one nobody but you could even see, the one that was quietly costing you energy every single day whether you noticed it or not. Here's your challenge, and I want you to actually take it. For the next 7 days, pick 3 moments a day where you'd normally over-explain and instead deliver the short, complete version and stop talking, even when it feels unbearable, especially when it feels unbearable, because that discomfort is the exact muscle this entire video was built to train. Keep it simple. You don't need a script for this, and you definitely don't need to announce to anyone that you're working on not over-explaining, which would just be a new, more elaborate explanation wearing a disguise. Just notice the moment, catch the sentence before it turns into a paragraph, and let it stay a sentence. Some days you'll catch it easily, other days the old habit will win, and you'll hear yourself 3 sentences deep into a justification nobody asked for. That's fine. Notice it, don't punish yourself for it, and catch the next one instead. This isn't about becoming a perfectly silent, unreadable person overnight. It's about slowly, deliberately shifting the ratio, one ordinary moment at a time, until the shorter sentence starts to feel like the natural one instead of the effortful one. And if you remember only one line from everything you just heard, remember this: the explanation you don't owe is the one that costs you the most to give. Say that back to yourself the next time the urge rises to justify something nobody actually questioned. If you're taking the challenge, comment the word "reclaimed" right now before this tab closes and the moment passes, because that comment is the difference between the thought you had and the decision you made. Type it and then go actually catch the first sentence today, before this feeling fades back into the noise of the rest of your afternoon. And if something in this actually shifted for you today, subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming, and I'd rather build it with you than explain it to an empty room. Thanks for staying to the end. Stay unexplained.